There are certain moments in life that reveal who people truly are. When James Carson stood on the Family Feud stage in April 2024 with his wife and her parents, he had no idea that his carefully constructed image was about to crumble. For years, he had maintained a perfect facade in front of his in-laws, playing the role of the devoted husband while treating his wife with contempt behind closed doors. But on that April afternoon, his mask slipped in the worst possible way. When he humiliated his wife Sarah in front of her parents on national television, Steve Harvey did something that shocked everyone in the studio. He shut it down immediately and delivered a message about respect and dignity that would change the Carson family forever. Before we share this powerful story about standing up for what is right, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters. The Carson family from Portland, Oregon, appeared on Family Feud that spring with what looked like perfect family harmony. James Carson was 35 years old, a financial advisor who had built a successful practice managing investments for wealthy clients. He was handsome, well-dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew how to make good impressions. He had mastered the art of being charming when it served his purposes, particularly when he was around people who could benefit his career or his image. Sarah Carson was 33 years old, a former elementary school teacher who had given up her career 3 years earlier when she and James had their first child. She had a gentle demeanor and a quiet way of speaking that some people mistook for shyness, but was actually the result of years of having her voice dismissed and diminished by her husband. Sarah had learned over the course of their 7-year marriage that expressing her opinions, especially when they differed from James's, often resulted in criticism, mockery, or cold silence that could last for days. Sarah's parents, Robert and Helen Mitchell, were in their early 60s. Robert had recently retired from a career as a high school principal, and Helen had worked as a nurse for 40 years before retiring the previous year. They were kind, traditional people who had raised Sarah with strong values about family, commitment, and working through difficulties. They lived in Seattle, about 3 hours from Portland, and saw their daughter and son-in-law several times a month. What Robert and Helen did not fully understand was that their daughter was deeply unhappy in her marriage. Sarah had never told them the truth about how James treated her. When they visited, James was attentive and affectionate, always playing the role of the devoted husband. He would compliment Sarah's cooking, ask her opinion on decisions, and speak about her with apparent pride and love. Robert and Helen thought their daughter had married well, that James was a good provider and a good husband. But behind closed doors, the reality was entirely different. James treated Sarah with contempt. He criticized her constantly, telling her she was not smart enough to understand his work, not interesting enough to discuss important topics, not attractive enough now that she had gained weight after having their daughter. He made all the decisions in their household without consulting her, controlled their finances completely, and made it clear that her role was to take care of their home and child while he focused on the important work of his career. Sarah had tried to talk to James about his treatment of her many times over the years. Each time, he would dismiss her concerns, telling her she was being too sensitive or that she should be grateful for the life he provided. He would remind her that she did not work, that he paid for everything, that she should appreciate him rather than complain. When she suggested marriage counseling, he laughed and said she was the one who needed therapy if she could not recognize how good she had it. Sarah had considered leaving James more than once, but several factors kept her stuck. She had no income of her own and limited recent work experience. She worried about disrupting their daughter Emma's life. And perhaps most significantly, she worried about disappointing her parents, who had always taught her that marriage was a commitment to work through rather than abandon at the first sign of trouble. She did not think they would understand that this was not just difficulty, but sustained emotional abuse. The invitation to appear on Family Feud had come through a connection James had made through his work. One of his clients had connections in television production and had mentioned the opportunity. James had immediately seen it as a good networking opportunity and a chance to enhance his image. He suggested they invite Sarah's parents to be part of the family team, knowing that it would look good to appear on television as a devoted son-in-law. Sarah had not wanted to do the show. She felt uncomfortable with the idea of pretending to be a happy family on television when the reality was so different. But James had insisted, and she had learned that disagreeing with James led to consequences that were not worth the fight. Her parents had been excited about the opportunity, touched that James had suggested including them, and Sarah had not wanted to disappoint them by refusing. As they prepared for the taping that April afternoon, James was in high spirits. He joked with the production staff, networked with other contestants, and played the role he always played in public. Sarah stood quietly nearby, wearing the outfit James had selected for her, having learned years ago that her own clothing choices were often criticized as not good enough. Her parents were excited and nervous, grateful to James for this opportunity and proud of their successful son-in-law. None of them knew that the carefully maintained fiction of their happy family was about to be shattered in the most public way possible. The game began with Steve Harvey's characteristic energy and warmth. The Carson family stood on one side of the stage, with James positioned prominently at the front, Sarah beside him looking more anxious than excited, and her parents, Robert and Helen, completing the family lineup. The competing family, the Torres family from Arizona, stood on the other side, and the atmosphere was filled with the usual game show excitement. Steve went down the line introducing each family member. When he reached James, James was immediately charming and personable, making jokes and clearly comfortable in the spotlight. When Steve spoke to Sarah, she gave brief, polite answers, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Robert and Helen were enthusiastic and warm, clearly excited about the experience. The first round began with a face-off between James and a member of the Torres family. Steve asked the question, "Name something a husband does that makes his wife feel appreciated." James buzzed in first and answered with confidence, "Buy her gifts." It was on the board as the number 3 answer. The Torres family member then answered help with housework, which was the number 1 answer. The Torres family won the face-off and chose to play. As the Torres family gave their answers, James stood with his family looking slightly annoyed that they had lost the face-off. When the Torres family eventually struck out after getting 3 answers on the board, the Carsons had a chance to steal. Steve asked the question again, "Name something a husband does that makes his wife feel appreciated." The Carson family huddled together. Robert suggested tell her he loves her, which seemed like a strong answer. Helen agreed, adding that words of affirmation were important. Sarah nodded quietly, not offering her own suggestion, having learned that James usually dismissed her ideas anyway. But James had a different thought. When they broke from the huddle, he stepped forward as their spokesperson. Before giving their answer to Steve, James turned to Sarah with a smile that looked affectionate to the audience, but that Sarah recognized as something else. He said, loud enough for the microphones to catch clearly, "Well, I buy Sarah plenty of gifts, but honestly, she does not appreciate anything I do. I work hard to give her a nice life, but she just sits at home all day while I'm out there providing for the family. Maybe if she lost some of that baby weight, she would feel better about herself." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Sarah's face went pale and then flushed red with humiliation. Her father Robert's expression changed from confused to angry in an instant. Her mother Helen looked shocked and hurt for her daughter. The studio audience did not know how to react to what they had just witnessed. James, apparently not recognizing that he had just crossed a serious line, continued talking. I am kidding," he said with a laugh that suggested he was not actually kidding at all. "But seriously, Steve, you know how it is. You try to be a good husband, but women are never satisfied, right?" Steve Harvey's face had gone completely serious. The warm, humorous expression he typically wore while hosting had vanished. But before Steve could respond, Robert Mitchell, Sarah's father, stepped forward. "What did you just say to my daughter?" Robert's voice was quiet but carried clearly through the studio. His face showed an anger that had been building as understanding dawned about how his son-in-law actually treated his daughter. James turned to his father-in-law, and for a moment his confident facade faltered as he realized Robert was genuinely angry. "I was just joking around, Robert. You know how it is on these shows, you are supposed to be entertaining." "Entertaining?" Robert repeated, his voice rising. "You just humiliated my daughter on national television. You mocked her weight, dismissed her value, and suggested she does nothing all day while you work. That is not entertainment, that is cruelty." Helen had moved to Sarah's side, putting her arm around her daughter who was fighting back tears. "Sarah," Helen said gently, "is this how he talks to you at home?" Sarah could not speak. She nodded, and the tears she had been holding back began to fall. Years of pent-up pain and humiliation were breaking through the dam she had built to contain them. James tried to regain control of the situation. "Sarah is being overly sensitive. We joke around like this all the time. Tell them, Sarah, tell them you are fine." But Sarah shook her head. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was shaking but clear. "No, I am not fine. I have not been fine for years. You treat me like I am worthless. You criticize everything I do. You make me feel small and stupid and useless. And I have been too scared and too ashamed to tell my parents the truth about what my marriage is really like." The studio was completely silent now. The Torres family stood uncomfortably at their podium, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. The audience did not know where to look. The production crew was unsure whether to keep filming or stop. And Steve Harvey, who had been standing frozen while this family drama unfolded, finally moved into action. Steve Harvey walked slowly but purposefully toward James Carson. When he reached him, he positioned himself between James and Sarah, a protective barrier that sent a clear message about whose side he was on. "Sir," Steve said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "we need to stop this game right now and address what just happened." James tried to maintain his composure. "Steve, I think there has been a misunderstanding. I was just trying to add some humor to the show. Sarah knows I love her." Steve shook his head slowly. "No, there is no misunderstanding. You just humiliated your wife on national television. You mocked her weight, dismissed her contributions to your family, and suggested she has no value. That is not humor, that is abuse." The word hung in the air. Abuse. James looked shocked that Steve had used that word, as if he had never considered that his treatment of Sarah could be characterized that way. Steve continued, his voice growing more passionate. "Let me tell you something about marriage and respect. When you stand up and make a vow to someone, you are promising to honor them, to cherish them, to treat them as a partner of equal value. You do not get to dismiss them, belittle them, or mock them, especially not in front of their parents, especially not on national television." He turned to address Sarah directly. "Ma'am, I need you to know something. The way your husband just treated you is not acceptable. It is not normal. It is not something you should have to tolerate. You are not being too sensitive. You are not overreacting. His behavior is wrong, period." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, clearly moved by having someone validate what she had been experiencing for years. Steve then turned to Robert and Helen. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I think your daughter just told you something very important. She told you that this is how he treats her regularly. She told you she has been afraid to tell you the truth. The question now is how you respond to that information." Robert's face showed a mixture of anger at James and guilt about not having seen what was happening to his daughter. "We should have known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We should have seen it. We should have asked more questions." Helen was holding Sarah close, crying herself. "Baby, why did you not tell us? Why did you think you had to hide this from us?" Sarah's voice was small. "Because you always taught me that marriage is forever, that you work through problems, that you do not give up. I thought if I told you how bad it was, you would be disappointed in me for not being able to make it work." Helen pulled back to look at her daughter's face. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell Carson, you listen to me. I did not raise you to accept abuse. I did not teach you that marriage is forever no matter what. I taught you that marriage requires both people to treat each other with love and respect. If one person is being cruel, that is not a marriage worth saving." Robert added, his voice firm, "Your mother is right. We failed you by not making it clear that there are limits to what you should tolerate, but we are making it clear now. You deserve better than this. You have always deserved better than this." Steve turned back to James, his expression showing no sympathy for the position James found himself in. "Sir, you need to understand something. Your wife has been suffering in silence, protecting your image, keeping your secrets. She has sacrificed her dignity to maintain the illusion that you are a good husband, and you have taken advantage of that sacrifice. You have treated her with contempt while she protected your reputation. That ends now." James's facade was crumbling. The confident, charming financial advisor was gone, replaced by a man who was being held publicly accountable for his private cruelty. "I never meant to hurt her," he said weakly. "You never meant to hurt her," Steve repeated, his voice incredulous. "Sir, you told her she does nothing all day. You mocked her weight on national television. You dismissed her value as a human being. How exactly did you think that would make her feel?" Steve did not wait for an answer. He turned to address the studio audience and the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to talk about something serious right now. We just witnessed what emotional abuse looks like. It looks like someone putting down their partner, making them feel worthless, dismissing their contributions, and then claiming it is just a joke or that their partner is too sensitive." He continued, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "Emotional abuse is insidious because it does not leave visible scars, but it damages people just as surely as physical violence does. It destroys self-esteem, creates fear and anxiety, and traps people in relationships where they feel they have no value and no options." Steve turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, I want you to know that you have options. You have parents who love you and support you. You have a daughter who needs to see her mother treated with respect. You have a life ahead of you that does not have to include someone who makes you feel small. You are worth more than that." He then addressed James one final time. "Sir, you have a choice to make. You can recognize what you have done, get serious help through counseling and therapy, and do the incredibly hard work of becoming a different person. Or you can continue to be the man who humiliates his wife and wonders why his marriage fails. But what you cannot do is continue to abuse your wife while maintaining your image as a good husband." That ends today. Your secret is out. Everyone knows now who you really are. The question is whether you have the courage and integrity to become someone better. James stood there looking defeated and exposed. The man who had walked onto the stage so confident and charming was gone, replaced by someone who had been forced to face the truth about himself in the most public way possible. Steve made a decision in that moment. We are going to stop taping. This family needs privacy to deal with what has just happened. Some things are more important than a game show. He turned to the Torres family. I apologize that your game has been interrupted by this. You will advance to the next round. Then he turned to the Carson family and Sarah's parents. Please come with me. We need to have a serious conversation about what happens next. What happened in the private room after the taping stopped would change the Carson family forever. With Steve Harvey present as a witness and a voice of reason, Sarah finally told her parents the full truth about her marriage. She described years of emotional abuse, of being made to feel worthless, of having every decision controlled by James, of living in fear of his criticism and his cold silences. She revealed that James controlled all their money, that she had no access to their bank accounts, that she had to ask permission to spend anything. She talked about how he monitored her phone and computer, how he criticized her friendships until she had isolated herself from most of her friends. She described how he had convinced her that no one else would want her, that she should be grateful he stayed with her despite her flaws. Robert and Helen listened with growing horror and guilt. They had failed to see what was happening to their daughter. They had accepted James's charming facade without questioning what was underneath. They had inadvertently taught Sarah that she should stay in a destructive marriage because they had emphasized the importance of commitment without making clear that commitment requires mutual respect. James, confronted with the full accounting of his behavior and unable to hide behind his usual defenses, finally began to show some genuine remorse. He acknowledged that he had been controlling and cruel. He admitted that he had taken advantage of Sarah's kind nature and her desire to make their marriage work. He confessed that he had felt entitled to treat her poorly because he earned the money and he thought that gave him power over her. Steve Harvey spoke to them all with wisdom earned from his own life experiences and mistakes. He talked about how abuse is about power and control, how abusers often charm others while terrorizing their partners, how victims stay not because they are weak, but because they have been systematically broken down. He talked about the courage it takes to leave, the support that victims need, and the responsibility that family and friends have to believe and support those who disclose abuse. Steve arranged for Sarah to speak with a domestic violence counselor that very day. He provided resources for both Sarah and her parents. He told James directly that he needed intensive therapy and that whether his marriage survived would depend entirely on whether he was willing to do the hard work of becoming a different person, which most abusers never actually do. Sarah left the studio that day with her parents. She did not go home with James. Robert and Helen took their daughter and granddaughter back to Seattle with them, giving Sarah space and safety to figure out what she wanted to do next. James returned to Portland alone, facing for the first time in his marriage the consequences of his actions. When the episode aired 2 months later, the production team included the incident with appropriate content warnings and resources for viewers experiencing domestic abuse. The decision to air such difficult content was not made lightly, but ultimately they felt the message was too important to bury. They edited it carefully to focus on the message of awareness and support rather than sensationalizing the drama. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Steve confronting James went viral within hours. Domestic violence hotlines reported a significant increase in calls from people who recognized their own relationships in what Sarah had described. Mental health professionals praised the segment for putting a spotlight on emotional abuse, which is often minimized or dismissed as not being real abuse. Sarah received thousands of messages from women and some men who understood exactly what she had experienced. Many said that seeing her find the courage to speak the truth on national television had given them the courage to speak their own truths. Countless people shared that they had been in emotionally abusive relationships, but had not recognized them as such until they saw Sarah's story and realized that their own experiences qualified as abuse. James Carson faced significant consequences. His professional reputation was damaged as clients questioned whether someone who abused his wife could be trusted to have their best interests at heart. His social circle learned the truth about who he was behind the charming facade. He lost friendships, professional relationships, and the respect of people who had admired him. Sarah filed for divorce 3 weeks after the Family Feud incident. With her parents' support, both emotional and financial, she hired an excellent attorney who ensured that she received a fair settlement and primary custody of their daughter, Emma. The divorce was not easy, as James attempted to maintain control through the legal process, but Sarah had found her voice and her strength. She refused to be intimidated or manipulated any longer. James did enter therapy, though whether it was genuine desire to change or an attempt to look better in the divorce proceedings was unclear. Some people can change, but many abusers simply learn to be better at hiding their behavior or at playing the victim. Time would tell which category James fell into. Sarah began rebuilding her life with the support of her parents. She moved back to Seattle to be near them and to have help with Emma while she figured out her next steps. She entered therapy herself to process the trauma of years of emotional abuse and to rebuild the self-esteem that James had systematically destroyed. She reconnected with friends she had lost touch with during her marriage. She began to remember who she had been before James had convinced her she was worthless. 6 months after the Family Feud incident, Sarah appeared on Steve Harvey's talk show for a follow-up interview. She looked different, stronger somehow, more present in her own body. She spoke clearly and confidently, a marked contrast to the quiet, anxious woman who had stood on the Family Feud stage. During the interview, Sarah talked about the journey of recovering from emotional abuse. She described how difficult it had been to recognize that what she had experienced was actually abuse, because it did not fit the image she had of what abuse looked like. She talked about the shame she had felt, the belief that if she had just been better somehow, James would have treated her better. She described the process of unlearning those false beliefs and recognizing that his behavior was his responsibility, not hers. Sarah spoke about the importance of her parents' support. When my mom told me that she had not raised me to accept abuse, when my dad said I deserved better, it gave me permission to leave. I had been so afraid of disappointing them, of them thinking I had failed at marriage. But they made it clear that staying with someone who abused me would have been the failure, not leaving him. She also talked about the unexpected gift of the public nature of the exposure. I never wanted my private pain to become public. But the truth is, the public exposure meant I could not minimize it or pretend it was not that bad. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew. And that accountability, as painful as it was, made it impossible for me to go back and pretend everything was fine. It forced me to deal with reality. Sarah had gone back to teaching, finding joy again in work she loved, and in having her own income and independence. She had started volunteering with a domestic violence organization, using her story to help others recognize the signs of emotional abuse. She spoke at community events, always emphasizing that abuse does not always look like what people expect it to look like, that it can be hidden behind a charming smile and a successful career. 1 year after the incident, Sarah wrote an open letter that was published in a major newspaper. In it, she thanked Steve Harvey for stopping the show and speaking the truth about what he had witnessed. She thanked her parents for believing her and supporting her decision to leave. She thanked the strangers who had sent messages of support and shared their own stories. And she offered a message to others in abusive relationships. If you are reading this and you see yourself in my story, please know that you deserve better. You deserve a partner who treats you with respect, who values your contributions, who does not make you feel small or worthless. You are not being too sensitive. You are not overreacting. If your partner makes you feel afraid or worthless, that is not love, that is abuse, and you do not have to stay. She continued, I know how hard it is to leave. I know the fear, the uncertainty, the shame. I know how you have been convinced that it is your fault, that you deserve the treatment you receive, that no one else would want you. Those are all lies that abusers tell to keep you trapped. The truth is that you have value, you have worth, and you deserve to be treated with dignity. The letter resonated with thousands of readers. Domestic violence organizations reported another surge in calls for help following its publication. Therapists reported clients bringing in the letter and saying, "This is my story," and finally being willing to address their abusive relationships. The impact of Sarah's story extended into unexpected areas. Human resources departments began including emotional abuse in their domestic violence policies and trainings. Medical professionals were trained to recognize signs of emotional abuse, not just physical violence. Schools included information about emotional abuse in their health education programs, teaching young people what healthy relationships should look like. James Carson's story took a different path. He went through the motions of therapy and claimed he had changed, but his actions told a different story. He dated other women after the divorce, and the patterns were similar. He was charming initially, then gradually became controlling and critical. Some of these women, having seen his Family Feud appearance and Sarah's story, recognized the warning signs early and left. Others were not so fortunate and experienced their own versions of what Sarah had endured before they finally left. James never achieved the same level of professional success he had enjoyed before the incident. The public knowledge of his abusive behavior followed him, and while some people were willing to overlook it, many were not. He lost the respectability and admiration he had worked so hard to cultivate, learning the hard way that reputation must be backed by character to endure. Sarah's daughter Emma, who had been only 2 years old at the time of the Family Feud incident, would grow up with a very different understanding of relationships than she would have had if Sarah had stayed. She would learn from her mother's example that self-respect matters, that abuse should never be tolerated, and that leaving a bad situation takes courage and is nothing to be ashamed of. She would see her mother as strong rather than weak, as someone who made hard choices to protect herself and her daughter. Robert and Helen, Sarah's parents, also learned important lessons. They recognized that they had inadvertently contributed to Sarah staying in an abusive marriage by emphasizing commitment without adequately emphasizing that abuse negates those commitments. They became advocates themselves, speaking to other parents about the importance of teaching children not just to stay committed to relationships, but to demand respect within those relationships. 3 years after the original incident, Steve Harvey reflected on the experience in an interview. He talked about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and the importance of using that platform to address serious issues even when it is uncomfortable or breaks from the expected entertainment format. When I saw James humiliate Sarah like that, when I heard what he said about her, I knew I had to stop the show, Steve explained. I could not just continue playing a game and pretending that what had just happened was acceptable. To do that would have been to send the message that emotional abuse is not a big deal, that it is okay to treat your spouse that way. I could not do that. He continued, "The response we got from that episode showed me how many people are living with emotional abuse and do not even recognize it as abuse. They think they are just in a difficult marriage, or that they are too sensitive, or that it is normal for partners to be critical and controlling." The fact that Sarah's story resonated with so many people shows how common this problem is and how much we need to talk about it openly. The Family Feud incident became part of a larger cultural conversation about emotional abuse, about the different forms abuse can take, and about the importance of supporting victims when they find the courage to speak up. It was referenced in books about domestic violence, cited in research about abuse patterns, and used as a teaching tool in counseling and social work programs. The episode remained one of the most impactful moments in Family Feud history, remembered not for entertainment value, but for the important conversation it sparked and the lives it potentially saved. For every person who called a domestic violence hotline after seeing it, for every person who recognized their own relationship in Sarah's story and made the decision to leave, for every parent who learned to talk to their children differently about relationships and respect, the painful public exposure had served a purpose. Sarah Carson's journey from victim to survivor to advocate demonstrated that it is possible to rebuild a life after abuse. She showed that speaking the truth, as painful and scary as it might be, can be the first step toward freedom. She proved that with support and resources, people can leave abusive relationships and create better lives for themselves and their children. The story of what happened on Family Feud that April day stood as a powerful reminder that emotional abuse is real abuse, that it happens in families that look perfect from the outside, and that speaking up about it is not being weak or breaking up a family, but rather having the courage to demand the dignity and respect that every person deserves.